Registered to join us today to learn about identity-based data collection, understanding the why. We're all in for a treat, and I will not delay. This is brought to you through an initiative with the Social Research and Planning Council. We have Huron Perth Public Health, Huron Perth Children's Aid Society, and United Way that gathered together to organize this workshop for you, understanding that there was a lot of community members that were interested to learn about this. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples, and that we are part of the Upper Canada treaties that were signed regarding this land. And these are treaties 29 and 45 and a half. And we also want to recognize that this is the dish with one spoon wampum treaty. And we have all agreed to care for the land and resources by the Great Lakes in peace. We also want to raise attention to the inequities of colonization that still remain with us. And we talk about this because we don't want history to repeat itself. We are always wanting to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation, which means we are educating ourselves how to do better so that we do not repeat this history. And we want to find ways to support our current and future generations of Indigenous people so that we can continue to build this inclusive community where everyone feels welcomed. I invite you to think about this statement, share with us what territory you are coming from if you are not in the same area as where I am, and if you have any actions that you are taking to support reconciliation, please share that in the chat box too. And without further ado, I am going to pass things over to Christian Wilson from Children's Aid Society to introduce our speakers.
And
Hi,
sorry,
folks.
Christian,
Yeah,
would you mind if
go
I
ahead.
I want to drop something in the chat really quick. I'm sorry, so sorry to interrupt.
Drop away.
But
Drop away.
before Christian introduces the speakers, I just want to, I'm dropping the feedback form in the chat. So you can, it's going to be very, very quick. You can open it up now and fill it at the end of the session. And the other thing I'm going to mention is that it's the Ontario election. And if any of you are working with any clients, any populations that may face barriers to voting in the election, it might be more difficult for them. There are folks you can contact who are working on that. So in Perth Wellington, there's a woman named Kim who's working on supporting populations with barriers to make sure they can vote. And there's a link for organizations who might be working with people who don't have an address to help them get to what they need to vote as well. So I'm dropping that stuff in the chat as well. This is the contact for the Perth Wellington riding, as well as the link to the information on what to do for electors without addresses if you support those people. And thanks, and I'll pass it back to Christian now. Sorry for interrupting.
Thanks, Will, Kristen. No worries. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today for the workshop called Identity-Based Data Collection, the Why. It's really exciting to see so many community partners with us today. I wanted to, before I introduce Michelle and Steve, acknowledge that's Black History Month, and gives us an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of Black communities in Canada, celebrate our Black colleagues, and I think it's important to acknowledge that as we start our conversation today. I did want to thank the United Way here on Perth Public Health for co-sponsoring this day with us and supporting having two really distinguished, knowledgeable, experienced folks with us today to help us learn. I really hope today we can advance our equity journeys as a community. Maya Angelou said, when you know better, do better. So today's a day where we will begin to know better. And I think it's an opportunity for us to start doing better within our community. We know collecting identity-based data can help us understand diverse needs, address systemic inequities, and tailor our services to be inclusive and effective. If we can do that as a community and be consistent with that, we'll be able to support our equity-deserving populations in a better way, in a more consistent way. So I'm very grateful and excited to announce today's two presenters who are esteemed colleagues and really good friends of mine and of the Huron Perth Children's Aid Society. So Michelle Young, firstly, is the founder and principal consultant of Centered Truth Counseling. She specializes in designing and delivering workshops and training sessions on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. Michelle also serves as the Human Rights and Equity Advisor for the Thames Valley District School Board. Notably, she was the first person of color to hold the Director of Service and Equity at the Children's Aid Society of London and Middlesex, where she spent over 21 years attempting to improve and not attempting, improving the lives of children involved with child welfare through systemic change. Our second presenter today is Steve Didham. He's a social worker with over 20 years of experience across sectors such as child welfare, mental health, addictions, and academia. He's the sole owner of Phoenix Consulting and Counseling and a part-time lecturer at the King's University College. Steve is also a child protection manager at the Children's Aid Society of London and Middlesex, leading a team of child protection workers who provide direct practice to vulnerable families and children. He's also a member of the Helping Consortium, which is an evidence-informed group of helping professionals. We're excited to learn from Michelle and Steve's expertise and insights today. Let's give them a warm welcome. So welcome. I clap, but we can all do our little.
Thank you, Christian.
You're welcome.
Steve, I'll let you take the next one.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in this space for the next 2 hours as we kind of dive into understanding a little bit more of the why around asking identity-based questions. So Christian, thank you for the introductions of Michelle and myself. So I will kind of gloss over the introductions. You've heard a little bit about us, and you'll probably learn a little bit more as we go along in these next 2 hours. So I'll just skip over the introductions. What we're going to dive into in recognizing that we only have 2 hours together. So this is going to go by really, really fast. So we're going to dive into understanding what is identity-based data. What is the collection? What does it mean? And then we're going to unpack it a little bit further and talk about social identities, intersectionality of identity, social determinants of health, and then kind of wrap those concepts together because they all kind of come together in understanding the complexity of identity. And then we're going to talk about why is collecting identity-based data important for your organization. And from, as Michelle and I were prepping for this morning and going over the amount of participants that are here, representing many organizations, there's a lot of you that are already doing this work. From our math, around 80% of your organizations that are represented on the screen this morning are doing some level of identity-based data collection. So we're going to talk a bit more about the why. For some of you, this may be a bit of an overview of knowledge that you already have, and we're hoping that we'll take it a little bit deeper in this conversation, while for others of you, some of these concepts may be newer. So we're going to provide sort of a macro overview, and we're going to embed opportunities for questions definitely at the end, but throughout our conversation with you this morning, if there are questions, please do raise your hand. You can use the chat, and Michelle and I will kind of go back and forth depending on, and I'm putting you on the spot, Michelle. We'll keep an eye for the person that's not presenting in the chat as well. But we do want to make sure that we embed some intentional time for you all to have an opportunity to ask us questions about this work, because it really is important that that you understand the deeper concept of the why in asking these questions. So that is the agenda. Anything you want to add, Michelle?
Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate what you said. So I always love being invited to sessions like this. And then I also have a little bit of panic. It's like, oh, you're the experts. Okay, so we've got some information. We have some experience. But as Steve said, you're coming from vast different organizations and places, and you have experiences with this work already. So as we go through, yes, there's a Q&A. There's a last slide that says, question and answers. However, we would really appreciate, he said embed, no, as they come, if you have questions, throw up your hand, use the little hand thing. The chat, I can try and follow the chat. I'm not always great. I'm just going to be honest about that. But really, it's a conversation. So really, when I looked at this, is we put some slides together, and we're going to have a conversation for a few hours. And there's some information that we have, or maybe different perspectives, but also recognizing and honoring that there are already going to be experiences that you have and expertise that others might also benefit from. So don't be shy. Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Whoops, give me a second here. Here we go. So who are we? So yes, we do love Christian, and if he says, "Can you come?" we always come. We really don't even ask questions. We just kind of show up, and that's who we are, and we trust him. For everyone else, he gave a very brief bio as to who I am. So yes, I'm Michelle Young. I go by the pronouns she and her. I identify as Jamaican Canadian. It was a great mix. My father was Jamaican, straight from Jamaica, also my mother, but she went via England. So there was a strong influence in my home. And my son now watches Coronation Street with me every night and claims it's my show. And I said, well, and I can watch it when I want. And he's like, wait a minute. And I'm like, oh, it's our show. So that's just one of the fine things. I do have a son who's 13. I'm going to call him a footballer, not NFL football. So he's not excited about the Super Bowl that'll be happening. We're talking sort of football, soccer. So that takes us to different spaces and countries. So we will be traveling to Italy with him this year, specifically around soccer. What else should you know? I've spent a lot of time in child welfare in Toronto, 2 years, and in London, Middlesex for over 19 and a half years. So I have a lot of experience there. And also at the time when we were bringing in identity-based data, that was also part of my role, was to support staff and try to understand some of the challenges. And sometimes, I'm going to be honest, I kind of shook my head and go, I don't understand why they don't understand. And really trying to understand that so I could support people. Also have my outside consulting that I do. So love to talk about equity. So this is really a special time for me this morning. And now I'm at the school board. So that's a whole different world. So I oversee the Human Rights and Equity Office here, but different spaces, but the stuff's the same because people are the same. So any questions that you have, anything you need to know, I always throw this out there. Sometimes people ask questions, sometimes they don't. Anything you need to know today before I hand it off to Steve about me that's going to make you comfortable to participate, or you're just curious? I don't see anything in the chat. This is your chance. Okay, you're still shy. That's okay. I'll respect that. Steve?
Thanks, Michelle. I guess what I'll share about myself briefly is a little bit about my equity journey. So my pronouns are he, him. Clearly, you can see that I'm a white guy, heterosexual, middle class, able-bodied, middle-aged. So I have some, and I'm sharing that with you intentionally because we're going to talk about social identities in a few minutes. But those are sort of some of my social identities and locations. And I remember when my equity journey began several years ago, I remember when identity-based data became a standard in child welfare. And it really wasn't rolled out all that well in terms of explaining the why. And I remember, asking questions about what gives me the right to ask these identity-based questions of people that I don't know. Because I didn't quite understand what the why, right? The why in identity. So that began my kind of journey of really leaning into understanding the complexity of identity, the complexity of us as human beings, and celebrating kind of those differences in recognizing that we're all kind of different people. So that led me to leaning into doing some deeper equity work, and especially working with white leaders and white colleagues, and understanding, especially from a racial lens, how whiteness and race kind of interplays in our interactions with one another unconsciously. So that kind of began my journey into equity. I'll end it right there because I could go on, and I'm cognizant of the time. I want to get into the material. And that brings me to this next slide. So as we dive in now to discussions about the why with respect to identity, one of my favorite quotes from our Brene Brown podcast is this: there's something much bigger than the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. It's the human case. How good do we want to be with and for each other? So I want you to kind of keep that at the back of your mind as we go forward in unpacking social identities and social determinants of health in terms of within your organization, how are you leaning into understanding the context of our work with other humans through an equity lens? So when we talk about, so first of all, when we talk about when we talk about identity-based data, it's important that we understand what does that mean. So identity-based data refers to information about a person's age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, indigeneity, race or ethnicity, and physical or developmental disabilities. So it's a real intentional way of finding out these various domains of the person's identity. And when we talk about social identities, this is what we're talking about. In my early journey of understanding equity, this was a bit of an aha moment for me in recognizing just how all of these identities are really socially constructed. Socially constructed. Underneath all of this, we're all human. However, these identities that we carry impact our life experiences, impact the quality of our life throughout our life journey. So race, gender, national origin, you can see them on the screen there, age, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. These social identities are kind of domains of our individual humanity that impact our lived experiences. Social identities. So they're social constructs. That was the big aha moment for me when I was understanding this early on, that they are socially constructed. There's a reason why these are kind of socially constructed, and certainly in today's world, lots of examples of how these play in terms of division and how they are used. So social identities. And then within those social identities, and I'm going to go through this for a few minutes, it's important that we understand that depending on what your identity is for these social constructs will significantly impact whether or not it will significantly impact your interaction with your social environment. So if you hold the dominant identity within the social constructs, then you will be then you will have a what would be considered a privileged identity. So if we're talking about sexual orientation, for example, as a heterosexual male, for me, walking this world is really, it really doesn't need to be at the forefront of my consciousness around how my sexual orientation plays out. If I hold my partner's hand, if I show a public display of affection, no matter where I am in the world, generally, I don't have to think at all about whether that's safe or not. Okay? That's not the same for our LGBTQ2S+ population. And so for me to have that awareness that I hold some power with respect to that identity is really important, especially in my service to humanity, with my work with other humans. And so when I'm working with a family or with a youth, I need to be aware that I might have an unconscious assumption that the person I'm working with is heterosexual because I am. And if I don't ask that question, there's a risk I'm going to make an assumption about that person's, that domain of that person's identity that might be incorrect. And in our work, depending on where you are working and what your organization, your service delivery is with your populations, this information can have varying degrees of importance, right? So for data collection in terms of your service recipients, there's lots of importance. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but definitely with respect to your clinical work with that person, the interactions with that person. So asking these questions helps us get to know that human being in front of us through the multiple identities that they carry. And this wheel of power and privilege pictorial gives a nice overview of where those dominant identities are. So the inner circle of this wheel is where the dominant identities of each of these social identities lie, where the power lies. As you get further out of that circle, you will see where their marginalized, oppressed identities lie. And then you can start to think about, as you are processing this, you can start to think about what might that mean in terms of that person interacting with our world, in terms of services, support, love, acceptance, community, etc. So these social identities are really, really important for us in our fields to be slowing down, understanding why asking these questions is important, and then leaning into looking at the context of your environment. Any questions? Because I just explained that pretty deeply. Are there any questions about what I've shared around social identities?
I'm watching the chat. I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay.
I think one thing to point out, Steve, is just that depending on people's experiences, they might have come across other wheels of power or privilege. And so the titles might be different. And I think not to get so much hung up on that, because we could either just add more to the circle, but really to, I think, focus on what you're talking about, that as we look at the center, there's certain power. There's certain power that you have just based on the identity that you've shared about yourself, your identities, that differs from mine. So there's certain areas that I will have power based on education, based on the job that I hold. We own our home, but then as you start to get closer, based on the color of my skin, also my gender, all of these other things come into play. So I think it's being mindful of those things when we're asking identity-based questions, and we can talk a lot more about this. But what might be someone's experience that you actually might be perceived as somewhat as a threat? And so I might not share that information depending on my experience, depending on where I land with education, depending on maybe a country that I've come from before coming to Canada, where that's not safe. That's not safe. So an even more rationale as to the understanding the why, and being able to explain that to people and really understanding where they might find themselves on that wheel.
Yeah, in my private practice, I do this with individuals, with couples, with families that I work with, and I'm really careful of doing exactly that, Michelle, which is slowing it down and explaining to the folks that I'm doing the work with around, I'm asking you these questions because I don't want to make any assumptions about who you are. And I also want to center these discussions because I want you to know that I have some awareness around social identities and impacts in terms of the life experience.
So we do have a question. So thank you, Hildy, for starting us off. Can you comment about passing privileges such as white passing or hidden disabilities? So that I'm not sure if that's a new concept for people, but when we talk about, it's Black History Month, so if we talk about passing in the context of a Black person passing, so as you know, I don't know if anyone's 100% of anything. So if someone's parent, let's say they're biracial, one parent might be Black, one parent might be white, or a grandparent, they identify as Black. However, to the general population, they might, what we would say, is pass. So their features are close enough to whiteness that a white person would perceive them to be white. So with that passing comes privilege. So if you ever, there's a book actually called Passing. There's books, Color Complex. The unfortunate thing is I first time I read that book, I think it was in the 90s when I was in university, and it's still relevant. So talking about that there are certain privileges that are afforded to people who look more to the mainstream. And if someone who finds themselves with that regards, can be any other race and background as well, as soon as there is possibly a mixing in their heritage, they might have the ability to pass. So they will be in spaces where people perceive them to be white, and they will get to see and hear conversations and also afford the privileges that come if they were white and identified as white. Disabilities, because a lot of people in our population and probably that you work with have invisible disabilities, that they are not in a wheelchair or they are not walking with an assisted device that makes it so obvious. And in that sense, that can work for them in certain situations and against them, because people aren't taking those disabilities into consideration, or also they're keeping them hidden. Right? Am I going to share that? Is this a safe space? Is there going to be some sort of blowback for me sharing that? Is that going to impact the service I might receive? Is that going to impact a specific job or employment or something like that? So when we talk about passing, there's positives and negatives that come with that. Because the other thing is, if, as I go back to the example of the Black person passing, I'm now privy to conversations that are very harmful that I might not have heard before. Also, person with a disability that's not visible, those able-bodied people might not know and understand or causing further harm than I'm now being exposed to. So that's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
And some you just can't. You can't hide. If it's visible, you can't. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, that therapeutic alliance, or the how you kind of manifest this, how you ask the questions, is going to be a big part around if the service recipient, the client, the person feels safe, right? Feels safe to speak their truth with you. And that's a whole different kind of conversation. We'll touch upon it on the end, but that therapeutic alliance is a key piece to really doing that active engagement, because these are personal questions, right?
Okay. So we've got another question here, Leah. Thank you. Are there important factors to consider for organizations to avoid tokenism when engaging in DEI practices?
Ooh.
Yeah.
It's a hard one, because people will say, well, you know, you've got this person, they have that identity. And I think there's a point where we have to have people who have those identities. I think it's being transparent about what it is. Like, what is the work we're entering into, and being transparent about what you know, what you don't know, calling on those expertise. And I think really being open with, if it is an identity that you've brought in, recognizing that that's also not an easy space to be in if you're the only one. Right? Because then people say, look, we hired so-and-so, they had a such and such disability, and now they're gone. See, there's nothing else we can do. But really, when we're talking about hiring and ways to avoid the tokenism, I think is to really be looking at how many people are we hiring? If it's a board of directors, how many people? It's really hard to be the only one. They don't have to be the same identity. But when you have people who are, when we look at this wheel, who have been pushed to the margins, so we're talking about marginalization, to have another person around the table or another person bringing another perspective helps, and also minimize that feeling of tokenism. Lauren, I see your hand.
Thank you. And I actually have I'm Lauren, I'm the physician consultant with HPPH and also the epidemiology team manager. So really interested in data collection.
Awesome.
And I have a follow-up question on that, which is, thank you, Leah, for asking it. It's just about how, in a space where you may be collecting information on paper, where you're not having a therapeutic relationship with someone, you're gathering info for program planning or for funding or what may it be in a more clinical realm, but where you're not sitting with that person and guiding through the questions, or like the census, I think would be another potential example on a larger scale. But if you had any tips or tricks on how to make that as as safe as possible for people to answer those questions. And I don't know if it's sufficient knowing the time constraints and that, again, you're not going to be interpreting. Is it saying, you know, this is optional and feel free to put or an other box or something like that. But this is really an area that I'd like to get more knowledge on. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's an awesome question because Steve and I actually had this conversation earlier this week going, most people might not be sitting with and having the ability to walk people through and explain. And I think it's what can be done even in that written piece. So isn't it in a language that they can understand? So if English isn't their first language, this can be very challenging. So can we go to the first language? Even when people, they might not be proficient, but they're able to function in English, I think that this is important. So is there a space to just have a little blurb on it? Is there a space also to have examples of where this was used? So an example I always go to is when I first started working at Children's Aid years ago, there was a mutual aid parenting program. So basically parents got together, they met and they supported one another. And then what happened there all of a sudden was a Spanish speaking one. I thought, well, that's kind of cool because a large number of population that were now coming to London, they were Spanish speaking and thought, okay, we can do this. So that was an example that I would use as to how did we use that information to better inform the service that's going to be provided. So I think it doesn't have to be a long thing, but I think some sort of explanation where someone can tie and go, oh, I see where they've used this. We'll have some examples as we go through that's fitting for whatever sector that you're in, because you do, again, want to gain their trust and their buy-in in some way, and you're not there. Some have public service announcement, things that were connected. I know years ago when the healthcare started asking those questions when you go to the doctor or the hospital, they had a little video. So if there's some way to connect with them, if you have this information, possibly languages, or going to those communities, this is information that's going to be asked at these times. I think that's an amazing way to also do that. But there is that whole why, because people will be suspicious or not think it's important. So not even if it's not suspicion, it's just like, why should I take 30 seconds, 30 minutes to do this? But if we can give that to them, communicate it in some way. And again, it doesn't have to be long. A lot of people don't like to read too much. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Steve.
Yeah, I just a few. There was another question for him. So thank you everybody for the questions. And Lauren, I'm going to add to what Michelle is sharing that will tie into Evangeline's question as well. And that is, and this will be for your organizations with your staff to really help them lean into the comfort of asking these questions. And the response rates, Evangeline, poor response rates, etc. You wonder why, right? So how do we kind of enhance and mitigate the fear or the lack of interest from our service recipients to give us this information? Because ultimately they have a right to say no, right? All we can do is explain why we're asking the questions, the importance of it, et cetera, et cetera. And that will be different for each of your organizations. But the comfort level of your staff, whether it's on the phone or obviously in person, that's going to be a big determining factor of if that person feels safe to share their identities with you. So the next slide, or the slide that's up right now, I'm going to dive into it a bit because it kind of speaks to it a little bit more. Bear in mind with our 2 hours today, these concepts are more of an introduction to these concepts. Michelle and I could literally spend the day, the rest of the morning, certainly on this slide alone, for example. So this will be more of an intro to this topic. So for your staff and for yourselves, as you're sitting with understanding the concept of identity, social identities, and why we need to be asking the questions, it's also important that you reflect on, and this is what would be considered a reflexive lens to the work. And that is, where do you hold dominant identities in social locations, right? With my identities, I basically check all the boxes of privileged identities. right? So it's really important for me to, ensure that I'm doing the work of raising my consciousness around what that privilege means, and understand, certainly as much as I can, to lean in, that there are different experiences for different identities, right? So that reflexive lens of, where do I hold privilege? Where might I not? Right? What does that mean in relation to my micro, macro, and meso world, right? The waters in which I swim. These are important pieces and concepts for you and for your staff to understand in doing this work. Because if you're not self-aware of your own identities and social locations, it's going to leave you vulnerable to unconscious bias, to ignorance, and to fear in terms of, well, how do I talk about race as a white person, for example? Right? That's often a very big area for white folks in terms of talking about race, right? Because what if I say something wrong? What if I, et cetera, and then fear can kind of seep in. So having an awareness of your own identities, social locations, and we'll talk about social determinants of health in a moment. And then, where do you hold marginalized identities, right? So for me, although I don't have marginalized social identities, some of my social determinants of health certainly give me some experiences with trauma and with internalized shame, and areas that I can kind of lean into it to imagine what those concepts might mean for somebody else. So dominant identities, marginalized identities, and you're using, and your staff are leaning into that reflexive lens of raising their consciousness so that we're slowing it down and getting to know the humans that we're working with through their identities and social locations. Any questions? Does that make sense?
I'm going to add something just before I flip to the next slide.
Perfect, Michelle. Thank you.
Because a lot of times, especially when I was at Children's Aid in London, there was a discomfort with staff. And I said, okay, who's really uncomfortable here? Well, they're not going to want to answer. No, this really has to do with your discomfort. Because if you explain to me why, and I get to have a voice, or I get to share how I want to share who I am, this isn't really about the recipient on the other end's discomfort. Sometimes it could be, but I think once you've explained it, sometimes it has to do with, like you said, some of the questions. So some of the questions that were asked and still asked in child welfare are about gender, sexual orientation, and people are like, I don't want to ask people's children those questions. And there was one example that Steve and I remember, another person who was doing equity work in the province, and their staff, he said this was an amazing experience because the staff went to the home. They're supposed to ask all of the children and the family about, how they identify. And there was a family member, he was about 13, who was in a wheelchair, and communication, he used a tablet to communicate. And so the worker thought, oh, well, you can just tell me. And they said, no, you can ask him. And so they proceeded to go through the questions, and he answered the question. Turns out that he identified as being gay. And again, when you're talking about disabilities and different things, people make assumptions about people who have certain visible disabilities, that they can't be sexual, they can't be this. And so we don't even ask the question. And so he was a little emotional because he said, no one's ever asked.
Wow.
Right? Everybody else gets asked. No one even considered that, his sexual orientation might not just be that of the mainstream and other things. And so the time that it took just to give him space to answer that question and to be asked was huge. So that was a big lesson for us as well. And I always remember that. Absolutely, Lauren. Excellent clients to make. See, ponder, discuss, actually. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Thank you.
That's an excellent example, Michelle.
Okay. Now.
Many years ago.
Okay, hang on. You wanna? Yeah, Will was excited because it just dives right into it. There's no ads, but it literally dives right into it. So I don't know if you want to set this up for us.
So, yeah, just for 30 seconds or so, because Kimberly does a beautiful job. This is a coin she created. So obviously she's going to do justice to what it means and what it looks like on the ground. But so we're going to talk about intersectionality now. So recognizing, and the way I look at it is kind of like a multifaceted lens to our uniqueness, right? Recognizing that we carry many identities and that at times those identities can intersect in various forms of oppression that can be difficult to see at the surface level. So this is why it's also important as we're collecting this data, asking these questions, that we're also embedding and developing, because it's not about perfecting this, but you're embedding and considering an intersectional lens to your clientele. So here's Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined this term, talking about it.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. She applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. Heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
All right. I wrote down something that really stood out to me, where there is no, oh my God, I can barely read my writing. Where there is no name to a problem, you can't see it. And when you can't see it, you can't solve it. And I really love that. That really stands out to me, not only about what we're talking about today, but for those of you that are going to kind of continue to expand your knowledge around oppression, equity, identities, social locations, etc. There's deeper concepts around how that impacts, and we're getting to this right now with respect to social determinants of health, the impacts of this reality and how it plays out at the surface level. And intersectionality is a great way, especially from an identity-based data collection lens, to begin thinking within your organizations around where may there be cracks, right? Where may there be intersections of oppression that are happening that are below the surface? And how do we begin to look at this data in a more intersectional way to better understand some of these, right? Some of these cracks that our clients are falling down. For those who belong to multiple minority and or disadvantaged groups. And this is going to be a lot of our clientels, right? Certainly from a child welfare lens, we work with generally the most oppressed, vulnerable humans in our geographical area, right? So and I'm not saying, and I know not all of you are with child welfare, I do know that. But for those who belong to multiple minority and or disadvantaged groups, mental health disparities are increasingly severe due to the effects of compounding inequities. And the next slide will kind of give you a visual around the complexity of identity. Oh no, I took it out. We had that one other wheel. I thought it was there.
It's still there. Don't worry.
Oh, it's coming
I
up.
left it in for you.
Thank you.
Yes,
we'll
Christian.
come to that. So pause that thought. We'll come back to the visual of intersectionality in a few minutes. Christian.
Yeah, I know it's your day, and I don't want to steal anything here, but
No,
there
no,
was a few
no.
of those questions that came up I wanted to comment before on, having an inclusive environment and tokenism within an environment. And the question I have is, if we can't do it within our organizations internally, how can we do it with the people that we serve in the community? And that's something to think about as we're doing this. What are we doing internally to build inclusive environments in our workplace, that then people understand that they're safe and that they can do the work in the community? Because if we can't get it done internally, then we certainly shouldn't be doing it out in the community. So that's just a rhetorical question. And then the question around people having discomfort in asking the questions, I find in child welfare, and I would assume it's other places, most, most, if not all of the time, the folks having the discomfort are the folks holding the power and the privilege. If you talk to people with lived experiences and from different backgrounds, they live this way and they ask those questions. So we have to start to check our whiteness and our privilege and our power, and be able to understand that that's what we're actually bringing. If we're uncomfortable, how do we think the folks on the other side are feeling? I just think it's important that, knowing that we're in a predominantly white rural community in here on Perth counties, we have to start to check our own privilege and understand what we're bringing to the table. Michelle always used to say, child welfare workers can go out and ask about sexual abuse, right?
Right.
Their private parts and things like that, but we can't ask them about their social location or where they came from. We just have to reframe the importance, right? That's our job to ask about those things, but it's also our job to know how people got to where they are through their social location. So those are just comments before you kept going I wanted to make. Thanks.
No, that's
Beautiful.
great. And thank you. And it's lovely when you hear people quote you back. It's like, okay, they're listening. But I honestly, that was the struggle that I had specifically with social workers who were doing, they have to go out and do a safety if a child has been sexually abused. They have to ask those questions. And I said, I'm assuming at no point were you ever comfortable having that conversation with a 5-year-old. Like, I think you do it because you have to, the importance of it. So if you hold their identities with such importance, then you'll ask. And people, once they feel that they can trust you, are comfortable sharing their story with you. But you have to make it a safe place. I see a hand. I see it's Bert. I'm wondering if that's Bert.
Yeah, it's Bert, and I can't turn my camera on because I'm driving.
I thought you were just hiding.
No, I'm driving, and I don't want you to look at the ceiling of the car.
Thank you.
So I'm Bert to the group. I'm the Human Rights, Equity, and Safe Schools System Principal for the Avon and Maitland District School Board. You can tell from my avatar, I'm Black. I'm African American. So I have a bit of history that I'm struggling with while being in Canada. So in 1790, the United States started doing a census asking for identity-based data since 1790. So I'm struggling when I immigrated to Canada 10 years ago in 2014, where those questions aren't asked. And so I don't understand what is the hold up of not wanting to ask the question in 2025. Because I know that I'm getting resistance in my school board right now, where I want to know the percentages of students in our schools and how that correlates with IEPs, how that correlates with discipline, how that correlates with how does it correlate? And without the baseline data, it's just anecdotal. So my question is, what was Canada's thing around not gathering the data in the first place?
Thanks, Bert.
Love it.
I mean, that's the question. I think it was before we even started officially this session this morning, we said in the States, they always collected this. As a kid growing up, I knew they collected it. I know that they asked those questions and people have to figure out what box to check and things like that. It's embedded in Canada's history. I think it's just unfortunately one of those things that goes back to how people are discriminated against. A good example that we'll talk about later that we had was the One Vision, One Voice. So Ontario Children's Aid Societies back in like 2013, finally, because for years, Black people had said we are overrepresented in this child welfare system. Outcomes are not the same. And finally, Toronto CAS, I don't know what called bravery, but I really think about who holds the power. So someone there had enough power at the time to say, we're going to give the stats to go along with all the anecdotes that we've been hearing for the past 50 plus years. And then from that, the truth came out. Yes, there's an overrepresentation. The outcomes are not the same. All of those things, which then pushed light to having a project to address those disparities and things. So Bert, I think it's a very Canadian way of continuing to oppress people. And that's why, like when you're saying 1790, you must have came and walked and thought, I have been put back in history and time that doesn't make any sense. Because not even just about race, disabilities, like the number of people that have a disability is huge, but yet they're underrepresented in different places of employment. Things are not accessible to them, whether it be on a website or trying to enter a building still. So it's when you have those numbers, then it kind of forces people to possibly have to consider doing things when they aren't just the stories about it. So when I think about things that you're doing right now, the fact that we're having this session is revolutionary. The fact that people are coming on and wanting to have this discussion, it shouldn't be revolutionary, but it kind of feels like it, you know. Yes, I see a hand. How do you pronounce it? It's like Akatrini? I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Kathy, sorry, we can't hear you, Kathy.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on with your microphone.
Is that better?
Oh,
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. I have sort of like a comment around how data is used and misused. And sort of there's that a lot of times it's that p-hacking scandals, right? Especially around where large data sets in the US were taken. And people kept playing with them until the p-values showed them something. But in the end, what it was correlation, not causation. It was really badly done data. And it disproportionately affected young Black students. So it ended up, so research and data itself was used to entrench power and to entrench racist views of children rather than helping. And so, you know, and traditionally scientists have been very reticent to be political or be overtly political or whatever. And yet, sort of, and I would call them the enemies of, you know, EDI and all of and rights have abused data. So I sometimes wonder where we have to, like, our responsibilities to make sure that the data we are collecting is not abused. And it's not enough to collect it correctly and to interpret it correctly and to use it correctly ourselves. Where is our responsibility that if we then send that data out there, that it isn't then abused, right? And we have a system in place where we can actually, you know, because we see it all the time. We see it in the US, yes, they collect all this data, but inevitably it crosses no longer my Twitter feed because I dumped that. But, you know, it crosses my social media feeds as misinterpretations of the data. And inevitably it tends to be from a racist lens. So I just wondering if we can comment a little bit around sort of the technical ways that we collect data and whether it's valid and then how it could be used.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any comments to how people are collecting data?
Yeah, I think this is where each of your organizations, and we'll talk about this towards the end, but it's about the integrity, the ethics behind really understanding the why. And then you're as an agency, you've got some policy, some policy that is actually embedded in practice around what you're doing with the data, because the data is important for service delivery. It's important for those gaps. There's lots of benefits, but you're right. It can also be used to further oppress, to further cause harm, to further divide. So this is where organizationally, not only in how you're doing it, but understanding core principally why you're doing it, and then what are you doing with that data and housing it. I think that's kind of my lens on it around integrity. And then there's some questions in the chat around, again, comfort and how do we actually manifest this. And, you know, honestly, with some of my team, we'll role play it, right? Because there is, and this is going back to social work 101, and I do it with my students sometimes as well. Normalizing that role playing can be really, really effective in helping you lean through the discomfort. Christian's earlier comment that it's usually, and it's not a causal relationship, but there's a strong correlation of folks that are the ones that are most uncomfortable, they usually tend to hold the more dominant identities, right? So definitely when we talk about race, I can tell you there's a lot of fragility of white folks talking about race. So we need to normalize that, talk about it so we can lean through that discomfort. And ultimately that is on our responsibility, in my view, in the work that we're doing in service to humanity, to really not only understand the why, but then how do we authentically connect and engage in these conversations with our clients. And Christian, your comment about, within the walls of your agency, are you equity aware? Are you on your collective journeys, knowing that everybody will be individually at different places, but collectively, are you doing that work of truly, and I forget who put it in the chat a little bit earlier around tokenism, etc. If it isn't happening in the walls of your agency, I can promise you it is not happening outside of the walls of your agency, maybe in silos, etc. But there really is a deep connection of embodying it within to bring it without.
I'm going to jump in because I don't want to lose sight of what Kathy's saying because this is so important, because people can use it for good or they can use it for evil. That is a
Correct.
fact. So I think there has to be, like you said, some policies and ethics put in place. If it can be as working together as peers, how do we secure this? Because there's information that people want from the school board, like Bert was talking about, but then people also look at, okay, what's the flip side of that? So you also have to be mindful of how things can be flipped. And are you positioned in order to address that? Because as much as we can say this is going to help the service, there are others who don't agree with what we're wanting to do.
Correct.
They don't want the money going there. They won't want, people should just learn English or whatever it is, right? That we don't want the service to be able to meet them where they're at. So we have to be mindful of the integrity of that data and how it can be used in a negative way. So how is it being collected? How is it being housed? Who has access? How is it being released? So I think that's where you as an agency start to connect with others. I think this is an area where we can look to the expertise, whether it's university, people are always looking for different projects and things. How do you bring them in with their level of expertise? Because I know that people say, oh, we're talking about diversity training or whatever training doesn't work. Conscious bias training. And then I'm the person who other people will leave it and say it's ineffectual, we're not going to do it. And then I want to look at the research. I'm the person who wants to understand underneath that, oh, well, you did a 1-day training and then you never followed it up with anything. So you can use that stat to say that it doesn't work. So when you're releasing stats, to be very protective, I think, of that. And I think what Kathy's saying is huge. And people really need to look at that and think we did a good thing. We got these numbers, we put it out, and now someone else has twisted it in a different way to say something else. Because I love stats when I took psychology in university, but then I also learned that you can make it do what you want it to do. So ensuring that those things are sound. So I just didn't want to have that kind of go by the wayside, because if you're going to be collecting it, now you've got to be responsible for it. Okay, so thank you again, Kathy. All right. Okay, so to somewhat keep us still on track here with the social determinants of health. So there are factors. I can be as healthy as I think I want to be, but there are factors that are going to be pitted against me from the beginning. So what is my race? And we've got a video that shows you a little later, and based on different spaces that you're in, you might also be familiar with this. Different things will factor in how healthy I will be able to be walking through the world. And then you put that with also when Steve went through this social location. So when all of these things are coming together, so that's why you want to be going through your identity-based data and pulling out who are we working with? Who are we serving? What are some of the things that they're up against? Is there food security that's going to impact them? Social exclusion, that's a huge thing. You know, people are dying of loneliness. Like seriously, that's not even a joke. So somehow they are excluded socially. What does that look like? Why is that? Is that from things from the wheel that we looked at? Is that based on their education, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation? So when we talk about, and you can see different lists, because Steve had another list, and I was like, that's from 2002. It's still relevant. Then I went to basically, I think it was Canada.ca and got this particular list. But I think just like the wheel, the words and things can change, but if you just have that understanding going in, a huge one is childhood experience. So childhood traumas, how does that impact where somebody is today? Let's say they're 31. Someone that you might want to be working with or your organization is providing a service to. So when we talk about social determinants of health, what are all these other things that have to be considered when we're wanting to work with someone? Okay, any questions about that? Comments? So now I'm going to show you. And I laugh because I thought it was really busy, but Steve loves this diagram. So I for my love for him, I put it out there. I get it, but sometimes I think it's just so busy. But it really breaks it down, social determinants of health. We take biology and genetic endowment, illness or disability. So all of these other things that are attached to that you can look at. So I think that's the one thing that it really does a great job of depicting. So if we talk about culture, so based on your culture, the marginalization, the racism, discrimination, which will also then lead to exclusion or possibly trauma. So all of those things that we really need to or to consider when you're talking, I think about the person as a whole person. So they might be coming to you for this, but what are all the other things on this wheel that are impacting how they come to you, or if they're not able to? So who are those who are not accessing the services who could, who need to? Education and literacy. So yes, that will lead to fewer opportunities for achievement, low health literacy. All of those things are connected. Reduced employment options. So your love of this diagram, Steve, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I like how it kind of pulls out what it might look like at the surface. And it will be important for your organizations to, as you're looking at identity-based data, to be looking at it through a trauma-informed lens. Trauma-informed lens, because what we're talking about here is really impacts on their life experience, so that when you're meeting with your clients and getting to know them at their age and stage of development, so the 31-year-old that you're meeting for the first time, you know, and I think back to the Bruce Perry book, What Happened to You, right? Getting a better understanding of what's led this person to be where they're at in their current reality, right? And social determinants of health in connection with identity-based data help us to take that human and put them in connection with their environment, right? So for Huron Perth, what are Black experiences, for example, in Huron Perth? How do you know, right? Understanding that trauma will definitely, having a trauma lens for that is vitally important, because what you're likely or what you may be seeing at the surface level is likely a manifestation of trauma. And that might look like addiction, it might look like mental health. And what I also like about the social determinants of health is it really brings the broader, concept of capitalism and class, and how that really impacts the life experience. And for those who are living in poverty, it just amplifies the challenges of daily life. So you go through each of these social determinants of health in connection with the identity-based data, because that's going to help your agencies begin to start to understand a little bit more about what you're seeing at the surface.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got a question. Shauna, I'd be interested to learn more about how privacy laws would help us protect the data and keep it within the org, knowing that there's an FOI component and FIPA and other applicable laws. So I'm not a lawyer. However, I think that that's where you can also come together as a community, and I think have these conversations around what are the privacy laws that or policies that you also have within your organizations. Also, I'm assuming, maybe wrong, but the identity-based data that's being collected is being collected anonymously, so people aren't names aren't attached to that. So that's also a thing to really share with people about how what they're sharing, how that's going to be collected. I think it's important to have someone or a group of people kind of really looking at, okay, what are the privacy laws? Because people, you want to be able to speak to that with people, or if you're not going to be able to see them. So that might be one of the things that you want to lay out is how that information is going to be remained sort of confidential for them. But you do need to know kind of who they are without their names and things being attached to that. But I think that's an important thing, because if someone is doing freedom of information, what exactly would they be entitled to see? Right. So I think that's a really good question. Okay. So this is just, why did this feel like it jumped? Hang on. Oh, because it did. Okay, I see Bert's hand.
Oh, Bert, yep.
Before I move us along.
Yeah, so I have a data person and she's extremely brilliant. And so she explained it to me. There's this thing called data suppression. So if an FOI is called, they'll get frustrated because it's so redacted, they are wasting their time. But for instance, for Avon Maitland, if we did a poll and say, okay, how many Black administrators are with Avon Maitland? Okay, it's 1. The next question could be, how many of the Black administrators of Avon Maitland experience discrimination? Okay, I'm the only one. So therefore, it's automatically going to be me. But because of data suppression, if the number, if I'm not mistaken, is 9 or below, that data is not released. But as a data manager, you have access to all of the data. So we can deal with that one incident and not identify that one person publicly.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And that happens here
Very
as well
good.
at our school board when we collect data. Like Bert said, if it's below a certain number, especially if it's because the information can be identified by schools.
Yeah.
And if you're, let's say, in a school where diversity is just slightly starting to shift, and there's maybe like, let's say, 2 South Asian families, that data will be suppressed in that way, just as Bert said. So it's to protect the identity of those individuals who've participated, but at the same time, at the level of the school, they can know what the issues are and be able to address them. So thank you for that. So this is nothing earth shattering, but really just to sort of center us in where we are in the conversation, understanding the why. So what we're doing today, having this discussion, is to strengthen knowledge and skills, hopefully, to mobilize evidence, accelerate systems change, and systems don't move quickly. So a lot of times it depends on how big. If you are a smaller organization, change can happen, I think, more easily. But this is one of those things, like when I gave the example of the One Vision, One Voice, so the overrepresentation of Black families in child welfare. That caused a shift. When that information was released, it caused a shift. It also caused other agencies to look at what is happening for families in their own communities. So you can see how those things can happen. And a lot of times, stories are great, they're true, they're heart-wrenching, but you can't move people or policies or go after certain money. People want to know numbers, they want to know data. And as was mentioned before, you want to have a baseline. Like, how do we know we're moving? It's not the end all and be all, but it is one way to demonstrate, have we shifted? We notice that our community has shifted. What have we done in response to that to better serve the needs of those who are new to our community, or the different shifts? Or we weren't aware that so many of our staff had learning disabilities, had other disabilities that weren't visible. So what are we doing to meet the needs of those staff without having them having to be the ones to come forward with that and disclose things. Service specificity. Organizations can better understand who they are serving. I think we understand that. Equitably prioritize intersectionality. So how do you prioritize things, right? So having an understanding of who you're serving, because there's points where we've only got so much money in the pot. We can only do this. So what is going to have some meaningful impact with the families? Improve action plans, implement plans to improve service outcomes. So just another reminder. Accountability, I think, again, where's the baseline? So how are we holding ourselves accountable? It's been 2 years we've been doing XYZ. Has there been an improvement? Has there been a shift in our community? Mitigates impact of bias and ignorance. Right, because now it's in front of you. You have some information that you might not have before. So you can't say, well, I didn't know. I didn't know that so many people from our community from Nepal, that we should be having language, something presented in the language they can understand. I didn't know that. This opens that up for you. Guides for program design. Absolutely. One thing when I was at London Children's Aid, there, we had a population, 2.5%, I think population was identified as Black, 2.5% identified as Indigenous. But in this one specific case, there are certain programs that you can get that we were able to have a program so that basically families could have a worker who looked like them. So what came out of that was the creation of the Black African Canadian team to service those communities. So yes, we want to do training, and I think it's great so we can train people who don't have that identity so they can work with those families better. But in the meantime, if we have people who have those identities, I think the two things eventually will meet, right? So we have those who we're training, we're talking about equity, we're having the conversations that we're having with you today. But in the meantime, there are people who can meet those needs on the ground right now. And the government of Ontario says, yes, under the Human Rights Code, you can have a program that does that. The only way you can do that is if you're able to say, what are our numbers? What are the outcomes? So being able to support programs like that. And if there's grants and different fundings and things that you can go after. Guys, programs informs development of anti-oppressive and anti-racist strategies. Absolutely. All right. So seek data in a culturally responsive and consensual manner. We've been talking about that. So is it in a language, in a way that's communicated? Also, education levels, we have to think about that. There's no point in putting information out there that you're going over top of people's heads and coming across in that way. Transparency is key. Why? Like I remember when I was in child welfare, I used to say to my staff, any question you ask a family or a child, you better know the why. Even start with it before you ask the question. Why? Because then you're not coming across as intrusive. There's actually a reason we're asking this. And the reason might not be as obvious to the person you're asking the question as it is to you. Because we're talking about this. We're used to this, right? There'll be a point where your staff are more comfortable. It doesn't mean the person at the other end is going to be comfortable. Engage with communities in meaningful ways, direct process, data collection, analysis. So if you see that there's a shift or there's a group or there's someone who can speak to, different municipalities might have someone who, there's a committee, people with disabilities. So how about going and getting their direct input, right? That's another way that people want to be engaged. Did you just come up with this? That whole thing, nothing about us without us. So it's another step. I know we don't have a lot of time, but it's another step where it'll possibly help you avoid a misstep. If there's people from those communities, even your staff who might be from these different populations who'd be able to provide information. Have a strong infrastructure of data collection. Yes, and that's where I say you have a community here. So everyone who's on screen here is invested in this to some degree. So when we're talking about data integrity and things like that, some might be farther along than others. So why not come together? I have, in my work, community of practice, when I was with child welfare, we did equity work, we had a community practice. I send an email out for a question, stuff comes back. Hey, can we have a meeting on this? You're doing this. You're a little bit ahead. You have that policy. Is it okay if we meet? So this is a free opportunity. You can say, now you can just send an email to somebody on the screen, say Michelle and Steve said it's okay to connect with you. Okay. Yeah, you do that. So we talked about, so these are the challenges. We're not going to lie, there's challenges to this. And I think the more that you work together as a community, like I said, there will be some who are farther along. It might be another opportunity where you bring someone else, where you speak specifically about data integrity and the sovereignty and privacy of those things. And maybe you bring in someone who has a level of expertise to come on like you did with us. Discomfort and fear, we talked about that. Kathy brought us to the misuse, which I think people need to be very mindful of. Your intentions might be good. It doesn't mean that those are the same intentions of others. Lack of resources, unclear value propositions and community benefits, limited training and capacity. So again, this is where I think you come together as a community. So if there are some gaps, some agencies are not able to bring in the expert, but we can share that cost so that we can all kind of move together as a community, I think is ideal. Okay. So in doing this, you're not the only ones. And as Bert pointed out, since 1790, we're quite behind the ball. However, in just doing a little bit of research, we were able to find, like in healthcare, education, policing and justice, social services, municipal governments, like everyone is collecting data. And many have already been using that data that they've collected to inform the work that they're doing, to shift things. So that's really important for you to not think, okay, we're the only ones. I think back to when Kathleen Wynne was in office, and this was one of her big things. They basically did an anti-Black racism, did a report, came forward, talked about how in all of these sectors that are actually mentioned on the screen, there was anti-Black racism happening for people. Then also exposed us to other areas where people are being marginalized. Like we talked about, whether it's disability, their sexual orientation, all of those things. So that's why people have been, I'm going to say forced in some regards, to collect it. The problem is when you force people and you don't provide proper training or understanding, you can cause a lot of harm.
Yeah.
A lot of harm. So I think, again, what we're doing here today, even having these conversations, is okay, how do we minimize that? How do we minimize that harm? How do we take from these other sectors that are already collecting this data, and what can we learn? And a lot of the stuff is public. You can go get it. And a lot of times, here's the thing, I honestly believe this because I do it. If you come across a report and thinking, how did they do that? You can just send them an email. 9 times out of 10, people are willing to provide that support.
Yep.
Share with you the learning that they've had to go through, the pain, because there might be things that we're missing. Okay, so real life examples. I talked about the Children's Aid one. The other one here, and I tried to look and I couldn't find anything for Huron Perth that was similar. But I remember when the pandemic started and other countries and other cities were talking about how it was negatively impacting those who were marginalized, because it really did. It exacerbated all those things that we talked about, social determinants of health, that was kind of blown up at the beginning of the pandemic. Middlesex London Health Unit started collecting. So I was like, wow, they started collecting identity-based data. So they were able to say, yes, people who have been pushed to the margins are being at the time negatively impacted by this pandemic. There's an overrepresentation of them who are contracting COVID. And it wasn't to say, COVID wasn't looking for people like, yeah, you're just poor. Everybody could get COVID. However, there was a disproportionate amount of people who were on the outer part of the circle that we talked about who were being impacted. As we move forward, do I think that they did all amazing things with that information? Unfortunately not. Because a lot of things came into play. How many people, housing was an issue. So when we were talking about back then, self-isolating, that was not possible for a lot of families. If we're talking about the jobs that people held, You know, I was privileged, work from home,
Yeah.
work from home. End of story. We're going to give you all the stuff to work from home and you're still going to get paid. Nothing shifted. What actually shifted was because I wasn't spending any money or driving anywhere. Right. But ultimately, there are people, you've got to go into work. These are the jobs, the service jobs, all of those things. You're being negatively impacted. You're also putting your family at risk, all of those things. So how do we take that and how do we learn from that moving forward? What needs to be in place? But I just thought that was a really good example of the health unit at that time saying, you know, other people are collecting this. What does that look like for London and Middlesex? And how can that be used? All right. One last video that kind of speaks to what we're talking about.
At Diversified Dynamic Care,
Hey,
our
this is
Dental
Will.
program
Will,
offers
this is what
seniors
happened.
socialization through therapeutic
So I'm gonna
programming.
hit skip.
Canadians might brag about universal health care, but data shows health is not a universal experience.
We're seeing here racial inequalities that play out literally in death, because we're talking here about mortality. This is about people dying from these conditions.
A report released by Statistics Canada highlights how Black adults face an increased risk of death from certain diseases compared with their white counterparts. The report's author says the findings can help inform better healthcare decisions.
It's important because it's a first step in reducing health inequality. If we don't have information, we don't know what we're dealing with.
For Black men, the relative risk of dying increased by nearly 140% for those living with HIV/AIDS, 42% in pancreatic cancer patients, and nearly 20% for those with prostate cancer. For Black women, the relative risk of dying increased by 500% for HIV/AIDS patients, 98% in mouth cancer patients, 56% for those with stomach cancer.
This is the first national study to look at mortality in Black adults. Doctors and advocates say the results indicate the gaps in care for Black Canadians.
Some of these conditions, so things like HIV, diabetes, cardiovascular outcomes, are conditions that are either preventable or they can have very good outcomes if they're caught early. So what this means is that there's a miss, right? There's a miss when it comes to prevention, a miss when it comes to screening.
Advocates are calling for attention and action at the national level.
Kind of strategy that mobilizes the investment, it mobilizes the research, and then mobilizes the focused interventions that are necessary to address these issues over the long term.
We want to be able to see this as a first step that we describe, we find out, and now we have to figure out why and then address and eliminate these disparities.
Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
Okay.
Canadians might brag about.
See, Will, it's not perfect. Okay. And this was a quote that Christian actually started us off with. Do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So we're going to make mistakes. And I think the more that you come together as a community and work together on this, they'll be minimal. And then we'll know how to move forward and correct those things. Okay.
There's a couple of things I want to add on before we get to questions, Michelle. And there's some questions in the chat that I've kind of made some comments about from folks that have asked some questions. And one of the questions in the chat was around when do we ask these questions. So for each of your organizations, that's going to be a little bit different, right? So for some of you, you may be asking these questions over the phone. And if you're doing it that way, oh, it's great to see everybody. This is so much better. Hello, everybody. But if you're doing it that way, right, over the phone, developing some comfort in how you are verbalizing, right, the why. How are you explaining to your service recipient the why of why you are asking these questions over the phone? That will be a skill set that each of you will develop with knowledge, and then of course doing, right, embedding it into your practice with authenticity and with comfort. And the only way you do that is stepping through it, right? But for those of you that are able to do it in person, it really will be dependent on the context, the relationship, the urgency of getting the information. Because ultimately, in terms of guiding principles, you want to ask this in a manner that is, and in a setting that is, as stress-free as possible, where you can be your authentic self with your client and just slow it down and explain why you're asking the questions, similar to what I did earlier in my example in my private practice. So the when, if you've got latitude and if you've got an ability to inject this conversation when you feel it's best for the therapeutic alliance and the work, that would be my recommendation about ideal. When you don't have that luxury, and it's over the phone or it's an intake kind of situation, then slowing it down and again explaining the why to your client to help mitigate the fear, because I will tell you the fear is going to be real, right? With our service recipients, and depending on where you work, that fear may be a bit larger. Like I'm thinking child welfare, clients are sometimes really hesitant to share that information with us, and rightfully so. And rightfully so. So this is where your staff and for each of you having an understanding of the why. We are asking these questions because we are beginning to understand more and more that our identities really impact our lived experience. And as Michelle beautifully connected, those social determinants of health are a big part of the environment, the waters in which our clients swim. So having an understanding of identities, developing a lens of intersectionality, and then contrasting that to your environment is going to be key. And those social determinants of health are also really important factors to contrast to those identities. And the biggest one that jumps out to me that Michelle covered was adverse childhood experiences. What we are learning more and more about ACEs and the developing brain and traumatic experiences and the impact that has on the human experience, on the lived experience, on the life trajectory of that person, really, really important for us to consider in this work. So it is foundational identity-based data, and it really is going to be an entry point because there's deeper kind of discussions that are going to be important for your organizations, especially your frontline staff, to understand around how does this show up at the surface, right? With mental health, with addictions, with usually several presenting kind of surface manifestations that we see with our clients struggling. And then you add in the social environment, right? Poverty, etc. So it's a multifaceted lens of the humans that we are working with. In terms of the suppression, this is new growth for me. I never even considered that. I'm not on the other side of data management and data stuff. So I appreciate, Kathy, your bringing it up and centering that question. What stood out for me is it'll be important for your organizations to have strategies for incidents where you're only going to have one reply or two replies that can then easily be figured out in terms of who that person in the survey or in the data collection might be. So having some internal processes of that data manager, for example, ensuring that data the person holding the data or the people holding the data have some understanding, some deeper understanding around the fragility and the importance of this data, so that when these outliers occur, there's a process of capturing that in a heart-centered kind of client-centered to your staff member kind of way. Kathy, I hope that makes sense to everybody. Kathy, go ahead.
Um, I was just going to say that I said everyone's collecting data, so beware of the mosaic effect, because and the data managers and the data people will know what that is. But I just wanted to say that if you set your threshold at 10 because you're collecting a certain kind of data, but then another organization is setting their threshold at 5 because they're collecting maybe some overlapping data, but different data. And then organization number 3 is collecting, and they may, right? Somebody could take those 3 data sets, pool them, and actually figure out, right, who they are, right? That's called the mosaic effect. So it's not just important to know what data you're collecting, what you're setting your threshold at. It's actually a really good idea for all the different organizations that are collecting data. Let's say if it's Huron Perth, to understand what other organizations are collecting and what they're making public, to make sure you don't actually run into the mosaic effect on data, right? So it's incredibly complicated, and I don't have a paper for a good formula for doing it, but I think that really good intentions within your own organization and your own policies can be really solid, but then there's unintended effects if you don't know what everybody else is collecting.
I think this is just the beginning of meetings that need to happen going forward, because I think you coming together as a community and doing this is going to tackle those things that you're talking about, Kathy. I also think pooling resources, and I'm going to come to you in just one second, Christian. And my brain just starts flying because I do love Huron Perth. So every opportunity we get to come, but I also look at it in a way that you're all needing to collect this data. You all need to communicate with the community that we're collecting this data. And I don't think it needs to be left to just one. I think it's almost like, I don't know if it's a public service announcement or whatever, when you come together, that there can just be this explanation, if it's a public service announcement type of thing that goes out to the community. And maybe you've taken on, I don't know, there's a high school kid who needs to do a project on a video to show this, and other things that people can go to your different places and different organizations and pick up, even if it's a little card that explains the purpose and in different languages, depending on who's in the community, of collecting. So wherever they go to the doctor's office, someone might be asking some questions. There's just this consistency that's happening, which will help with people being more comfortable with sharing that and you getting the information that you need to get. But I really see an opportunity for you to really come together as a community in doing that. Go to Christian, then go to Holly.
Thanks. The really cool thing about our community is that we do have a social research and planning council. And I think if you talk about the context to this meeting today was back about a year ago, the council started to say, why don't we bring data folks together from different organizations or people who want to lead and try and collect something so we can speak the same language, deliver the same message, and do those things. That went downhill pretty quick, and we're here. This is where we're here today. So we backed up, and we thought we'd start with why should we do this as a community? So I absolutely agree. That would be an amazing next step.
Yep.
My hope is that there's more interest after today to do this work. It's so important. So I just wanted to say this is a year in the making to get to here today, and awesome. I'm very happy that we are here, but we do have next steps to take.
Thank you.
I've been thinking a lot too about sort of like collaborative approach and I think some themes I keep hearing is like communication and how do we kind of communicate. The other thing that I've been thinking about is like this work is important to me and I support it. And so as a result, I'm on a number of committees that sort of look at broader strategies. However, some of them are called EDI, some of them are called DEI, some of them are called EDIAA, one of them is called IDAR. And I wonder about like how can we even just frame for common language to make this more accessible? Because again, we've talked a little bit about like the fear and hesitation, and I think sometimes if I'm wondering if there's any thoughts on like what is a good way to kind of approach common language, because I think that's been challenging for me when I go to different places, that sometimes I think there's hesitation, and I'm not just talking about identity-based data collection as a broader strategy. I know that that's just something that I've experienced is we are and we aren't speaking the same language, and I just didn't know if you had kind of any thoughts or direction about how we can maybe come together and unify, because I think that might be a big piece also in how we communicate to our broader community, not just, the folks who are here who have the interests and are maybe willing to lean in a bit.
Great question. Michelle, do you want me to take a stab?
Take a stab. You can try.
So in terms of the terminology, from my lens, so this is my perspective, don't get lost in it. In Canada, I think it's more EDI. In the States, it's more DEI. Some folks do EDI and add a D in terms of decolonizing social work practice. So that's a component I add to it, for example. So my thing is, don't get lost on the acronyms, etc. Really what this is, in my view, is equity. Understanding equity and understanding its connections to humanity, and developing some understanding of trauma. So there's kind of a multifaceted thing, but the acronym I wouldn't get lost on. Now, the real thing there that really stood out about your question, Holly, is around the fear and the waters in which we swim with respect to EDI in 2025, right? And what's happening in the US in this very, very overt anti-DEI kind of movement. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of, my worries about what's happening. It's scary. And DEI has been really kind of used in a way that's quite worrisome in terms of division, et cetera. And some of that is, happening here in Canada as well. We have to have our eyes wide open around what's happening here as well. So, our clients, your service recipients, your staff are swimming in these waters as well. So recognizing the why is going to be really uber important for all of your organizations now more than ever, in embedding and developing this lens in terms of the work. Because it really is about, from my lens, it's about developing a real empathy for the human experience, and that we all have many identities. We all have social determinants of health, and they bring us to who we are today. And if we can have some better understanding and that reflexivity around engaging with our service recipients in a deeper way to really understand who they are, not that we can save anybody, but it's going to give us a greater opportunity to look at where is the intervention, what makes sense for a service delivery at this time for this group or for this person. I went off on a bit of a tangent, Holly. I hope I answered. Michelle, do you want to add anything?
Just really quick. So I'm with Steve. Don't get caught up in the acronyms. I actually grow to start to hate acronyms, because then it's like, even for our slides, Steve had an acronym for identity-based data. I'm like, that's not an acronym I use. Take out the acronym. Just use it in its full. So if you're going to be having a group in your community that's going to be addressing identity, just call it exactly what it is. So it's very clear for everyone and not get lost in the acronyms. And I see Dana.
Thank you, Steve. It's nice to see you again, and Michelle, it's nice to meet you over the virtual connections. I appreciate this conversation and the chance to think about what this means in Huron Perth. Welcome to Huron Perth, Michelle. It's really a great place to be.
I know it is.
Spent most of our lives here. Celebrate the opportunity to bring this community together to focus on making the kinds of improvements that we both are recommending to us today for consideration, but also the upcoming training that you will be both co-hosting for some folks on the call as well. A couple of things that I'm kind of sitting with, and maybe I missed it in terms of the social location reference earlier, Steve, but I found myself wondering a bit about age. We talk about gender, we talk about race. Age, I wonder about just in terms of power and privilege for seniors. I mean, that's outside of my mandate, but we provide a lot of support and service to grandparents who are caring for their grandchildren. So I found myself wondering about that. And our mandate is kids 0 to 16. And I find myself in lots of conversations where I reflect. I think, kids don't have a lot of power. They don't have a lot of privilege. That there's an extra layer. But how do we take that into consideration as we are supporting families as well? So I'm sitting a little bit with a question around age. And then a follow-up perhaps to your comment, Christian, would be we do have EDID priority within our child mental health service planning. And Kristen, you have contributed to some good consideration around that. Christian has, school boards have. So there's an opportunity for us to align some of this work or connect some of this work to some of that planning as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just some thoughts that I thought I would share as we're wrapping some things up, but I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Dana. And age, it wasn't to be excluded at all. It's on there. As I become a woman of a certain age, you start to no, it's real. It's real. And I have a mother who's a senior. So when you're talking about even accessing healthcare, she's a Black woman, she's 82, and how there's times I have to go to appointments with her. She's fully capable, but there's just a way that people are treated at a certain age. And what you're talking about, Dana, as well, like we've got grandparents caring for children who don't have a lot of voice in certain spaces. And then we also can't have a grandparent being excluded because of their age. So that is something that needs to be considered just similarly in the same way that we're looking at all the other things on that, the wheel. And when people are thinking about identities, and those are the ones that shift, right? They shift. Like there's a certain way I might be treated at 40, different than when I hit 65 or above. So that also is a shift that's challenging for people who are experiencing that. That all of a sudden now, especially for women, just socially speaking, now all of a sudden you're invisible. It's getting better because there are women of our age who are just like, no, we're not invisible, and then are coming with their power and using their power in those spaces. But that isn't always the case now. If we add age and we do sort of that intersectionality, Dana, with that, how is that impacting families and children that we're working with? So thank you for raising that. Okay.
I thought I saw someone. Oh, Vicky. Oh, she's. Hello, Vicky. I saw your hand raised, so I wasn't sure if you were going to ask a question as well. Sorry, everybody.
Okay. Okay.
So we've got about 12 minutes and we want to go right till 12 o'clock, if possible. So any other questions around anything we've talked about? A reminder, this is a foundational kind of concept lens. For those of you that are going to be taking the 6 series of equity starting next week, actually, we're going to go deeper into some of these layers of identity, of social locations, of social determinants, of trauma, and really get into the, for example, internalized oppression and dominance, really get into some concepts about how this manifests and impacts all of us. So looking forward to that training. Any questions about what we've covered today?
Questions, comments?
Yeah.
Christian.
Just one more rhetorical question maybe. And I think I often find myself in community meetings, and this is not purposeful, but we don't talk about identities of folks that we're serving. And my question is, if we're not doing this as organizations and we're not doing this as communities, are we causing more harm to the people we all serve? I think often we hear from them when we do ask that we are, right? So if we're not taking this into account, I mean, this is just the basics of asking the questions and getting to know who we serve. It's then how do we resource those overrepresented populations and folks? And child welfare has had to take a real hard look at this. Because we haven't done a good job at all. We've done harm for most of our existence. And we need to really look hard at that. And how do we resource folks that we continue and understand we could still be doing harm if we don't know these things and take them into account. So that's just, even if we don't get it together as a community for 3 years, organizations and individuals need to consider the harm they could be doing if they're not taking this into account.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I would, and Lauren, I see your hand there. We'll come to you in 1 second. But Christian, to further your question, your rhetorical question, my answer would be yes. We would be causing harm. So, and that's the key piece here, is really understanding the why around bias. So these are some more deeper concepts, but understanding unconscious bias, understanding how our privileges, our identities shape how we see the world, right? These are important pieces. That reflexive lens that I spoke about earlier, that's a real important one in terms of how we're showing up in that therapeutic relationship, in that exchange with our clients. So, the risk, and I guess I wouldn't say it's a causal absolute, we will cause harm, but there's a significant risk that we will miss something, our ignorance, our lack of knowing, right? That may perpetuate further harm or may cause harm indirectly. So that's why that quote of Maya Angelou is one of my favorites, right? As you learn to know better, to do better. Because this isn't about shaming any of us. It isn't about pointing fingers, etc. This is a conversation about understanding why embedding this lens of social identities and locations is really critical to our ability to connect and hopefully inspire some growth, some change, etc. Right? Recognizing none of us can save anybody. Right? So letting go of that saviorism piece and really leaning into, how do I show up? How do I show up? And what is my role as a social worker, as a therapist, as an advocate, as a professional, as an intake worker, whatever your roles are, how do I show up in this space? Lauren.
Thank you. My question is around AI and biases in AI. And I think it's fair to say AI is rapidly moving and here to stay, and will get more and more prevalent in many areas of work we do and in society. Certainly HPPH has an AI policy that aims to, with what we have now and what we know now, chiefly have safety around data and privacy. But I was curious, with that context, if anyone has any high yield resources or thoughts or insights on how we can appropriately understand and manage AI in terms of how it can be biased in the machine learning or in the way AI is used in a way that may also affect the populations we serve. It's a
Good question, Lauren. Good question. So while folks ponder that, because that is a good one, and gosh, it's a good question. We'll go to Patricia and let others ponder that, Lauren. So we'll come back. Patricia.
Great, thank you. So I'm from the Alzheimer's Society of Waterloo Wellington. We've got a couple of staff members here today. And just coming from a different lens, because it seems like a lot of the other participants are in working with the youth, where we're working with the seniors. So one of the things that I've noticed while I'm collecting these demographics is that the younger folks seem to be much more open about talking about their identities. Whereas the seniors that are 65 plus, some people actually are quite offended when you ask them for their gender or for their sexual orientation. So I'm just wondering if you had any suggestions on how to kind of navigate that conversation.
Great question. Michelle, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think it's, again, the educating, because we're talking about a generation where we didn't have these conversations. We're talking about a generation where, depending on if when I came to the country or how I grew up, that would be a negative thing. Like you're using this information for a negative reason. I think sometimes if there's family members, like you said, the younger ones, to kind of bring them into the conversation, as you probably already are doing. But again, I think it comes back to we want to provide, a service that's going to meet your needs, and we're trying to ensure, like if we have a certain group of people who are from a certain community, there might be activities or things that so I think it's giving them examples that kind of go along with why you're asking, probably things you're already doing, Patricia. But I'm just thinking, again, like if someone asked my mom, who's 82, her first reaction might be like, so you don't think I fit? Right? Because you're coming from a generation when she came to Canada, you were already othered.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So having her understand the why of that we want to include you. So that is why I think if you do a lot of kind of groundwork around that, or when families are coming to right off the hop, introduce them to that. So maybe that's something that they can help that person who's more of the senior that's coming understand, and they can have that connection and that level of trust. But I'm just thinking, yeah, if my mom came and you started asking, it's like, okay, are you trying to other me, or have you already othered me?
Exactly.
Am I not going to fit? You don't have a group. I can't be in the choir. Like all of these things will be going through her mind. And you're thinking, no, we just want to know, like maybe there's some songs from when you were whatever in Jamaica or in England, or you know what I mean? So I think again, it seems so simplistic, the response I'm giving you. But again, it's if they understand why you're asking, or if you have examples as to what you've done with information when you've received it, then they go, oh, okay. And then they might be a little more receptive.
They tend to be then, and then they're generally like, oh, well, I'm just normal, so it's fine.
Right. Because again, of that time, I just want to be normal. I want to fit. I don't want to be excluded. So if you're asking me questions that might not have me feel like I'm normal or have others think I'm not. So when you kind of normalize that, I think you probably experienced it goes a lot farther with them. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Kristen, you put your hand down. We still have time for you. We've got 3 minutes.
Well, I don't have a question. I just have a final comment. So I won't take up the space.
That's okay, unless there's anything else. I love this. Hopefully, if we can move together on this as a community, it will help build trust in some of the communities that have cause to be a bit suspicious about these 100%. Questions. Absolutely, absolutely. Because if they're getting it from every little space that they might enter, they're like, oh, okay, they asked me that when I went to the hospital. They asked me that here. Okay, this is what's happening with our community. This is the shift that's happening. And Will has put in again the survey, the feedback. So please click on that. And I'm going to give it to you, Kristen.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Steve and Michelle. I have been excitedly awaiting this conversation and workshop because as Kristen alluded to before, Social Research and Planning Council has been in the space trying to learn from others and find out what's happening and move these practices forward. And we came to realize that this foundational conversation of why we would be doing this as a community needed to happen. So we're excited for the work ahead to gather with folks here because we had over 100 people here today. So I'm thinking there's a lot of interest in this and that there's a lot of work that we can do together to just do better, right? And nobody's coming at it with the approach, certainly not Social Research and Planning Council as experts. We're just curious and we understand there's a need for this. And we can all come at it with our different roles and mandates to strengthen each other. So I will follow up. We'll send an email out to all of the participants. This session was also recorded, so we hope that it is also shared with colleagues and coworkers so that we can share this knowledge with others. And I want to thank everybody for coming. And as Dana mentioned earlier, Michelle and Steve are doing a series of 6 workshops moving forward. If you were interested to learn more about that, I would suggest that you reach out to Dana Bozzato, or if you don't have her contact information, reach out to me and I can connect you. So thank you again, Michelle, Steve. It's been wonderful having you. You come back anytime. We'll love to have you and welcome you anytime you can join us. Thank you. And thanks again to
wonderful
Children's Aid Society and Huron Perth
Public
Health for pulling this together with us.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate you all. Have a beautiful day.